I don't know if any of you had the chance to see last Sunday's New York Times, where Darren Walker had a conversation with Elton John. So we decided that rather than doing this panel, I would do my version. So we have Donny Osmond coming in just a moment. So if you guys just want to go back and sit down, that'd be all right. Yeah. Sorry. And I think, just as with the last panel, and what three incredibly thoughtful folks we had, my job is to set the table just a little bit and get out of the way. This is a panel that I think only USC could concoct. These are three of the finest people I know in philanthropy and in nonprofit service. I serve on Michael's board. I've worked extensively with Xav at Ford, and Tonya is our colleague in Detroit and is just as good as they come in philanthropy. And so it's a huge pleasure to have these three folks on the stage. I think in some ways, even more than the last panel, we're going to be less about synthesis than maybe about sort of testing some propositions. Michael, I haven't had a chance to tell you this, but for Tonya and Xav, we've talked a little bit about this, almost sort of asking some of the existential questions that I think sometimes don't get asked during the course of a really smart, thoughtful, highly choreographed sequence of conversations among people who I think all essentially are supportive of the construct. I think what we really want to try to do today is to talk a little bit about whether there isn't a case to be made that we're not necessarily asking the right questions in the right form at the right time. And so we're gonna probably move all over the place, but I think I'm gonna ask each of the panelists to talk about obviously what's top of mind, but in many ways talk a little bit to the point of really what is genuinely the value of this proposition. What does it really mean if the field is to move forward? And I think the last panel sort of set that question up in the sense that there are a lot of first principles that I think are increasingly shared in the room and across the field. But is it enough? Are we missing something? Are there questions that we're not asking that sort of lie at the sort of the sharp edge of next generation approaches? Let's sort of not take this for granted. So given that impossible sort of opening salvo, I was thinking that we would ask first Tonya and then Xav and then Michael to talk a little bit about some of your impressions, some of the questions that the past couple of days have raised in your mind, and then we'll sort of take it from there. So Tonya, I don't think needs any introduction, runs the Skillman Foundation. Skillman has led the way in Detroit on a number of fronts. One is education reform, which is just a desperately difficult question in Detroit, and Skillman, more than a decade ago, really staked out its ground in a way that is extraordinarily courageous. They have sort of stepped right into the middle of what I think everyone believes is sort of the most intractable issue in our community. And they've also sort of married that to a very sophisticated place-based set of strategies in a handful of neighborhoods around town, and again have really stuck through this work in thick and thin. Xav probably again needs no introduction to you, but when Darren Walker built out his new team at Ford and announced that Xav would be joining him, I think everybody that I know thought that you just don't do any better than that. If you wanted someone at the head of what I would argue the most powerful foundation in the world, and perhaps the most influential in some of the issues that we're talking about these last couple of days, you want someone of Xav's ability and integrity and just profound brilliance at the head. And Michael is a legend in the field. He could have stayed at Pew forever, and and done wonderful things there. But he took over at LISC, and for the last, how many years, Michael?
15.
15 years, has completely remade LISC into a construct, a set of operations that in many ways reflect the very principles that this conference is talking about. And so it'll be, I think, fascinating to get Michael to reflect a little bit on what those last dozen or 15 years have meant to the field. So let me get out of the way and ask Tonya to get us going. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Rip. So I'm going to try and hit 6 points, and I'm going to go really briefly because I really want us to get into a discussion. So the first point that I want to make is I can't breathe. I can't breathe. We're having an extraordinarily sterile conversation when the people we say we're really trying to help are out on the streets, laying on the ground, and it's not in the discussion. So the first thing I would just say is we have to get out of the theoretical. This is not about how much research, how much learning. I mean, of course we have to learn. It's also about how do we begin to tie that theoretical, that research, the practice to the real needs that are on the ground that are being articulated and being led by the people we care most about. Second, I would say, is that I don't think that we're using technology as an accelerator in the work. I think that, I was struck by the comment about how we have probably been more circular in our learning versus evolutionary. And I actually don't think that that's true. I think in the last few years, I think we've actually made some extraordinarily important pivots in place-based work or place-conscious work, however you want to describe it. And I think the reason that we're making those pivots is actually because of technology. Because we can actually use data real time to understand, to dissect and really understand how we might deploy strategies and influence them. But are we using it to actually advance and put forth new bodies of work and in meaningful ways? So when I think about resident engagement, when I think about power building, when I think about organizing, all of those different things, think about how technology is being used in that, especially around issues. But we don't often spend much time about bringing those kinds of techniques to place. And it's at some point we're going to have to do that. That's just one example of it. The third is, I believe in learning to learn. But come on, guys, we got to stop looking backwards on this work. It's about time that we start to forecast. How about we learn to forecast? Learn from what has happened in the field to begin to think about what we need to do going forward, thinking about the political conditions that we're going to be facing, as well as the coming trends. I often am just struck by how we're not integrating that into our discussion at all. I could say more about that, but I'm going to move because I want to get to these guys. The fourth is that I think that we have this ongoing tension that we're inadequately addressing. And that's simply the tension between systemic, cohort, and this kind of targeted universalism strategies that need to go on. In our work, we know that we need to do all three of them, but we're not spending enough time talking about how you integrate them. How do you make the hard choices about which strategy is the most important strategy at that particular time, and how you make them interplay to bring back a set of results that give us proof points, but at the same time is changing the system. And I just don't think that we adequately address or think about it or spend the time on what does that discipline look like. We all know we need to have it. Bob Ross talked about it at the very beginning, and he said, I don't know how to do it. Most of us don't know how to do it. Most of us are mucking around in the dark, and it's about time that we shed a little bit of light on it and figure out what we're trying to get accomplished. The fifth point is this. Investors in this work often sit apart from the people who are doing the work, almost like the work is the people, the places are petri dishes. At some point, we have to figure out that we are engaged in the change process, that we're a part of the quotient, And we have to understand our role, how we advance or hurt or harm the work that's happening on the ground, and also take some responsibility and accountability in the work. We cannot say to low-income, essentially powerless places, you should go change your city. You should go change the country, and I'm going to give you $500,000 to do it. And if only you bring all of these best practices, you can change the world. And then we evaluate them, and then we say, well, you didn't accomplish it. Of course they did not. We already know what the conditions are in these places, but yet and still, we're not bringing our resources to that work as investors in philanthropic organizations. I often talk about philanthropy being an oligarchy. And if we know that, then why aren't we using our institutions to try and begin to shift power, bring power to these organizations, to these places in a way that actually might give them or equip them to improve the places that they live in these issues and begin to tackle these issues that we're trying to address. And then the last point I would say, I was struck by John Barrow's commentary about new leaders in the work and in the monograph as well. And I do believe that this work creates new leaders. But I'm curious, where are they? Because this is old home week for me, and I've been doing it for 20 years. Where are the new leaders? Why aren't we making space for them? Why aren't we allowing new ideas in our work? Why are we we're going kind of circular around some same old ideas instead of pivoting forward in a different direction?
Sam, up to you.
Okay. Let me try and build on what Tonya had to say, and let me say that another way. Let me try to respond in some way to the challenge she put before us. First of all, it seems to me this is, even if it feels like old home week to some extent, this is a very timely conversation, an important conversation. In the wake of the foreclosure come financial crisis, in the wake of the enactment of healthcare reform in the early years of implementation, in the wake of the Great Recession, and yes, in the wake of Ferguson and Staten Island and Cleveland and more, this is a very timely and even an urgent conversation. And that is to say, it's both classic. Much of what we've been talking about the last day and a half is familiar stuff. It's familiar tensions. It's perennials in the field, if you will. And at the same time, it is, or it can be, particularly with the kinds of principles that Tonya just outlined, it can be very contemporary and I think very cutting edge as well. And our challenge is, I think, to get there. I think that to say it's timely and to say it's urgent, and I strongly believe it's both of those, to have a conversation, a critical one, about place-based approaches and philanthropy, is not to say we should take for granted the value of the approaches to your intro rip. If anything, we could take all of this as an invitation to reimagine how we make the case for the value, who we make that case to, how we create meaningful openings at the table for young leaders, especially young leaders of color in this country. Even potentially how we create connections that span the globe. That too could be part of the conversation on labor and on other fronts, because of the number of issues before us that are truly global in character. So I take all of this, I hope I can take all of this and invite you to take all of this as an invitation to do those things. In other words, not simply to confirm what we already think about the inherent value and to sort of welcome others to the demonstrated wisdom that this is so critical, but rather to reimagine and to push ourselves to think about new actors, new kinds of risk-taking, pushing our own comfort zones in philanthropy, in the nonprofit sector, in business practice as well. In part because the conversation has been organized and the monograph was organized to speak to public policy and markets. I want to take a moment on each of those, again, as part of this kind of first conversation starting round here. Let me start with the market and try to underline and build on some things that Andrew said earlier this morning. I think one of the reasons this conversation is timely, and one of the ways in which it can push us to a new set of arguments, a new set of risk-taking, and I hope a new level of impact, is because there's something very important going on in the marketplace, and I don't think we've named it adequately yet, let alone taken advantage. And that is, there is a conversation going on in the business world, in America, and in other parts of the world about high road business practice, about inclusive economic growth. And I would even call it inclusive capitalism. It involves a fundamental rethink. It is not your grandmother's corporate social responsibility, thankfully. It is something much more than creating a division or a department for social responsibility. It is about mainstream business practice, incorporating environmental and social values, looking beyond quarterly earnings and what companies themselves often describe as the tyranny of quarterly earnings and the short-term view they impose, often bad for workers, bad for communities, bad for the environment, and more corporate leaders are saying bad for companies themselves. There is something more fundamental going on. It will not happen by magic. It will not simply unfold, but we have the makings of something that includes high road employment, doing something at last to shake this country out of this trajectory we've been on for over a generation now, being a country of poverty wages, of low-wage jobs, a prolific creator of bad jobs in our economy. High road employment is a piece of it. High road sourcing or purchasing is another piece, supply chains if you prefer. High road investment is a third. Impact investment, as Andrew and many call it. It is telling, it is encouraging that millennials and others want to use their money in ways that are consistent with their values. That can be a powerful thing. We are still in the early stages of it. We have a long way to go, but it is potentially very, very big. And philanthropy and nonprofits and businesses can be a part of making that real. I mention all of this not simply because I think these things are important and because I think they will require a lot of collective imagination and energy, but because place-based approaches are very relevant. The power of place and the business case for rethinking place and place-based relationships, local labor markets, local supply chains, local food systems, as Judith and others said on the earlier panel. There is a new room for developing these and making the case. None of this so far, and what I'm saying, speaks to Ferguson. And I want to get to that in just a moment. But I wanted to start with the market in part because it's been one of the frames for this convening and for the boundaries of the conversation. I think that connecting place-based approaches to that movement that is afoot, and it cannot be limited to businesses sort of having the conversation amongst themselves. This is very, very important, and it's in front of us in a way that hasn't been true in a very, very long time, arguably in a couple of generations. Number two, public policy, and briefly, just to get us started here. As Judith and Luke and others, Casey said on the earlier panel, there are very few things about public policy, at least it's been my experience in and out of government and as a citizen, too. There are very few things about public policy that you can standardize, cookie cutter, and just mail in from Washington or Sacramento or fill in the blank. There are important things that rely on local relationship building, creating a kind of virtuous inside game, outside game of change, taking the kind of moral power and outrage that we've seen in the months since Ferguson in particular, and in the days since the grand jury decision, of course, taking the kind of creative nonviolence we saw last night in New York City and in so many other communities across the country, of getting from, as we have in our best days as a country, in making the trip from outrage to problem solving. And it is something which at the end of the day must happen locally. It has to happen with attention to the kinds of things we've talked about within the framework of this conference. That's not to say there's one way to do it, or that everything is, a kind of neighborhood by neighborhood intervention. I think the broader way in which this group has talked about and the monograph has talked about place-based work is very, very important. But at the end of the day, if you look across the country, our settlement patterns, the social mix of different communities, still wide-ranging. The civic infrastructure, as the report, as the monograph calls it, is quite different from place to place, so a cookie-cutter approach won't work. None of that is to say that every community has to reinvent the wheel. That's the pitfall we fall into. It's all got to be custom-built and engineered and so on. If you look at policing alone, that's not true. If you look at how community policing was invented over a generation ago, it wasn't a case of reinventing one community at a time. It was about serious pressure politics and outrage, quite frankly, stimulating a conversation about changing institutional practices, changing the mundane stuff, the trainings, the promotions, what's on the sergeant's exam. How do you reconcile the protection of the public with the duty to serve and the ways that officers think about managing risk in concrete situations? I'm not a policing expert, I won't dwell on the details of it, but I say all this to say some of the lessons of that reinvention, which we clearly need to build on now, and if anything, extend into criminal justice reform and more, highlight the ways in which national conversations, state-level systems change, these things have to interact with local, place-based, community-mobilized problem-solving. We have always depended on that and a kind of virtuous conversation between the very local and the much larger and the more systemic at so many different stages of our history, from that invention of community policing a generation ago, the civil rights movement in a different way even earlier, and all the other important changes that pushed us forward as a country. The labor movement, which was born in very specific places and conditions, but went viral in the ways we would say today. It was grown in certain community contexts, and that will, I think, continue to be true. I'll stop here, but both on public policy and on the market, I think it's the case that place-based approaches in their diversity have something very powerful and important to contribute, but we shouldn't take for granted. That value is known, that we're working with all the right partners, that all the right young voices, or any of the young voices, frankly, are at the decision-making tables, and we can do a lot better at advancing that. Let me stop there.
Good luck, Michael.
I'm going to follow that.
Exactly.
Okay. By the way, you will know me on this panel because I'm the one who doesn't have an endowment. That's the that's the distinction we've made here. I have no idea what I'm doing on this panel, and now that I've heard Zab talk, now I really don't know what I'm doing on this panel. But anyway, LISC obviously is an organization that deals every day with place-based initiatives. That's who we are. That's what we do. So I think what I'll try to do is to think about, what Xav has laid out is fantastic, and it sort of looks at the larger trends and the higher level issues, the 20,000-foot issues. Let me talk a little bit about underneath what's going on, at least what we see is going on in the place-based initiatives and what they have to offer and whether they are strong or weak these days. For us at LISC, we define what we mean by place-based comprehensive community development initiatives by a strategy that we call building sustainable communities. And we put this in place in 2007. And basically it is intended to accomplish 5 broad goals in neighborhoods. One is to develop and maintain affordable housing. A second is to expand family income and wealth. The third is to increase activity in economic development areas, economic development opportunities and activities. The fourth is to improve access to quality education. And the fifth is to create healthy and safe environments and neighborhoods. Now, we have rolled out over that period of time, and even before that, a whole series of programs and initiatives and products to address those 5 goal areas. I'm not going to go through them all today. They're available on our website if you care to look. Suffice it to say that as of right now, we are, I would say, that we are seriously pursuing this strategy in 63 neighborhoods across the country. Now, what do I mean by seriously pursuing? I mean that if you look at these neighborhoods, LISC has itself invested at least $5 million in each neighborhood, and in many cases much more than that. And these neighborhoods are all pursuing those 5 goals. We think not only is that in itself an accomplishment, I think, not for us so much, but the fact that there are so many neighborhoods out there that are capable of doing this, if you think about what's involved in those 5 goals I outlined. But we think the strategy is working also. And the reason we do is because, for example, LISC has invested roughly $750 million in those 63 neighborhoods since 2007. But that has leveraged over $3 billion in development and programs in those neighborhoods. And that's obviously been provided by other sources. So we take that as a very positive indicator. Secondly, you can see it. You can go into most of these neighborhoods, not all, but most of these neighborhoods, and see the difference. The physical rebirth is obvious. They're much better off than they were 8 or 10 years ago, and they're much better off in many cases than in comparison to neighborhoods in that city even today. Third, if you talk to people who are running agencies and organizations that are serving those neighborhoods, what you will find is that they share a common vision of what they're trying to accomplish in that neighborhood. Not only do they know what their role is in trying to accomplish those goals, they know what the role of the other partners is in trying to accomplish those goals. So in effect, what we've created is a coalition of public and private, nonprofit, for-profit agencies in these neighborhoods who form kind of a governance and accountability structure, holding each other accountable to carry out the roles that they've taken on for themselves. And most importantly, I think, right now, we're beginning to get some results from data that we've been collecting since the beginning of this initiative in 2007. You know, people have often said the places are getting better, but what about the people? So we put a research design in place at the beginning to get at that question. How are people being impacted by what's going on in these neighborhoods? And the first report from that effort is coincidentally coming out next week. And it looked at 2 indicators. We're looking at a whole variety of indicators and collecting a whole variety of data. But this first report looks at 2 indicators. And those indicators are resident income and employment. And what our results show is that if you compare the neighborhoods, our target neighborhoods, with similar neighborhoods in the same cities, there is a direct correlation between increased LISC investment and increases in resident employment and income. Now, I can't claim a cause and effect there. This is not a controlled trial. It is a comparison study. We're looking at our neighborhoods versus other neighborhoods. But we certainly feel that those are very promising results and that we're very encouraged by the results, that we're on the right track. So I think there's a lot of good things going on in these neighborhoods, and it's not just neighborhoods we're involved in. These 63 I'm talking about just happen to be the ones that we've already invested $5 million in. There are a lot of other neighborhoods we work in that will be coming online, I'm sure, in the coming years. But there's a lot going on out there. There's an infrastructure that's been created that I think a lot of you know about. So there's a lot to build on in terms of what comes underneath. I mean, what Xav was talking about was what goes on up here, and that's fine. There has to be something underneath to connect to that, and I think the beginnings of that are out there. What are we learning from all of this? Well, we've learned a lot, but I would say there's 5 or 6 things I just want to tick off very quickly. One is comprehensiveness does matter. If you're working in this area and having success, you don't want something else over here that you're not paying attention to undermine that effort. So comprehensiveness really is important, and it is achievable. And I think we're demonstrating that in many of the neighborhoods where we work. Secondly, localness matters. Now, you heard some of this earlier today. We have a strategy, Building Sustainable Community strategy, that is a framework for how we implement programs in neighborhoods, but it does not prescribe how you go about that, which programs, which areas get the emphases first, who's going to implement it. Those are all local decisions. This is a strategy that is adaptable to many different localities and already has been adapted to many local localities. The third thing that we're learning is that partnerships matter. That's not a surprise either, I don't think. Partnerships within neighborhoods, but even more importantly, partnerships outside the neighborhoods, reaching out to the city level, to the regional level, to make use of resources and opportunities at those levels as well. 4, community engagement matters. We find, and again, no surprise here, you involve people early on in the process, get them deeply involved in what's going on, creating a plan, beginning to implement the plan. That kind of engagement right from the beginning is absolutely critical to long-term success. And finally, I would say local leadership matters. I've talked about partnerships. Partnerships are important. But you also have to have a lead agency, a convening agency, a backbone organization, call it what you will. There has to be a local organization who takes the responsibility to convene the others, to collect the information, to keep everybody honest and keep everybody accountable. So I would say those lessons, those 5, have been very important for us. But the larger point is that there really is an infrastructure that's been built out there, that is functioning out there in places as disparate as Duluth, Minnesota, and Boston, and Chicago, and Philadelphia, and San Diego. I invite any of you who would like, we would be happy to show you around and show you some of this as well. But I will leave it there and leave it to Rip to make something connect about all these things we've been talking about.
Yeah. So maybe provocation is the road to connection. So Xav and Tonya, you know, you've got Michael's 5 building blocks, right? It seems to me, Xav, the question you were asking is actually not a 20,000-foot question. It is at some level, but it is, aside from the sort of the demonstrative efficacy of job creation and residential income and the sort of the physical infrastructure that Michael described, there is something about the politics, the passion, the social connectivity that somehow is at the 5-foot level. It's not at the 20,000-foot level. And that, if I understood Tonya correctly, it may well be that philanthropy in particular hasn't really engaged that at the level of sort of taking responsibility for really helping build the kind of connections, the kind of passion capacity, whatever it is, the kind of impulse-driving kind of work that gets at the really difficult, sort of more, you know, elusive kinds of issues that it seemed to me that you were trying to describe. So, the provoke, you know, is Michael's enough? I mean, can you build communities just by building out sort of 5 discrete bodies of activity that add up to some more jobs and some increased income?
Well, I would say, those pillars are tremendously important, and I take Michael's point that these underpinnings need to be there. We have a lot of evidence to say they need to be there. I think, though, that we need to ask ourselves some really hard questions, or honest questions, unsettling questions. And Tonya hit on this when she, with her opener. Number one, are we on a road to doing it in a way that's commensurate with the scale of the problem as the country changes in all kinds of ways? I would say thus far, no. There are 45,000 units of state and local government in this country, for example. Do we really believe we're going to create a capacity building program, or 4 of them, and roll them out in tens of thousands of places? I don't see it happening. I don't see it happening with 50 Skillmans and Fords and Kresges and Gates, or even with a different fiscal picture, frankly. I think we have to be imaginative about the dimensions of the problem, and that includes government's capacity at all levels, and it also includes community capacity or civic capacity, if you like. And this gets to what you're describing, Rip, as the 5-foot view, or the grassroots piece of the problem or the challenge. I think that where that is concerned, we're building community capacity or helping communities act on their agendas, define their agendas and act on them is concerned. Just a couple quick observations, and I am new to philanthropy, so apologies if this is either old hat or is a bit out of school from a newcomer, but there is the question of philanthropy in its comfort zone, and of the lack of appetite for things like policy advocacy, movement building, investing in creative politics, if you will, particularly at the grassroots level. I think there are all kinds of things that explain that, certain things about philanthropy that have been inherently conservative for a very, very long time. It's nothing new. I think there's certain things about the 1960s that got us here, in a sense that, well, we had all that protest, now it's time to move on to collaboration and program and well-defined plans and skilled staff in all the right places. On some level, place-based approaches have always been part movement and part industry, I think. And at our best, there's a creative tension between those two. And it's useful, but we're not always at our best. And I think that there are ways, I don't want to speak for Tonya, I don't know if this is where she was going with her comments, but if we are in a wide range of places to be able to invest in, to be able to support community leadership, we got to recognize that's going to take all kinds of different forms in different parts of the country. We got to recognize there is some craft to it. There are frameworks that are helpful. There are ways you can know whether you are making progress or not. But it is not the stuff of pro formas in real estate. It's not going to look like that. You're going to be unsettled some days. You're going to have people who aren't they aren't thrilled to see your board of trustees come to the neighborhood. They aren't just going to celebrate you. Sorry. People are upset and they have things that they want to call you to account for. And the question is, do we have the courage and the appetite to invest in that and to be called out? That to me is a really important question. Otherwise, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter whether you're a legacy foundation like a Ford Foundation or you were incorporated yesterday and you are a new philanthropy and you see yourself as edgy and technology savvy and all kinds of other things. If you do not have the appetite to invest and support that kind of work, if you think it is too fuzzy and ill-defined and vague and unrelated to solving real problems in this country, then you're not going to be a part of this change at the scale that I think this moment and this era calls for.
Tonya. Oh, and get back to Michael. Go ahead, Tonya, please. Go ahead.
So I would just say, so I'm thinking about a logic model right now. And the reason I'm thinking about a logic model is because that's the kind of conversation we're having. We're having a logic model conversation, meaning when we think about the elements of what needs to happen in place, we know what they are. We got them in a big box. We have, 5 or 6 boxes. I think Michael is right on the things that he's talking about. But the problem with the logic model in my mind is that all of the logic is in the arrows from box to box. You never articulate it. You never really figure out what the assumptions are. You never tell what the context is. And I feel like that's where I struggle in the conversation, and I struggle over the last couple of days, because it's almost as if we talk about this work as if you're really smart, you can solve it. We're preparing place-based work like we're going to a lecture when we know guerrilla warfare is needed. And I get confused in that. So I get confused. It's always, so Zav, forgive me, because I'm not actually attacking you on this, or I'm not attacking anybody. My point is that it's always a timely conversation, but is it ever an urgent conversation? And that's the place where I think I struggle at, is that we're not having this urgent conversation. And I think we sometimes grasp for new ideas that we think are going to solve issues that are actually not in the context of reality. So I am grateful. Let me just say, we work very closely with several corporations in Detroit and Michigan who have made significant investments in place. Sometimes, and we've accomplished a lot of great things on that. But when we look at the distribution of wealth and how people are paying income, corporations aren't leading the change that we're talking about, and nor do I expect them to until they start changing the way that they distribute income and jobs and where they are going to go and get people and place people in jobs. If I don't see that as evidence, I'm not putting my money there, nor am I putting my faith there that they're going to be driving the change. Where we're seeing distribution of income and where we're seeing people get new jobs and having access to jobs that have living wage is coming from people who are rising up and saying, I deserve a living wage. And you see those movements across the country. And so it's a both and, I suppose, in my mind. It's about being realistic in this work, and not saying that anything that we're talking about is not realistic, but grounding it in what practice really looks like. I just feel like that for me feels very absent from the work that we're talking about, and especially even when we talk about distilling the lessons that that's coming out of this work. Well, I could have distilled most of these lessons 10 years ago, and most of them 20 years ago. Quite honestly, they were distilled then. But I think there are different lessons already on the ground, but I don't think that we're capturing them because they may not land the same way in different places. And so I think that we have to not just say that every neighborhood is not the same. Of course it's not. But I think we also need to make sure that every lesson that we learn is not going to be applicable to every place, and that we need to create some space for us to really have a divergent thoughts about what some of these lessons mean. And I guess I'm craving that debate. I'm craving the debate about what this might mean, what it might look like.
Rip, forgive me, I just want to sort of probe on this for a second. Tonya, can you say more about what you think some of those lessons are, just to give us a sense? Things that we're not capturing and aren't necessarily talking about?
Yeah, so I think we talk a ton about leadership. And so one example would be, how is leadership actually translating into power? How is leadership actually translating into investment into these places? So how do we dig into those things and figure out what is causing it? What happens in one place or another? And I guess maybe it was in the monograph, I'm not sure, or maybe one of the panelists shared a little bit about this. But this notion of kind of heroes in the work. And I think that we have to get beyond that. And I think we have to begin to start to figure out what are the drivers. And I think understanding the drivers are going to come from us actually making hard decisions about prioritization when we talk about how the importance of comprehensiveness is,
Yep.
how important it is.
Yep.
And how people navigate that in leadership is probably more important than just that we need to create leadership pathways, or we need, so I want to dig into those kinds of conversations, and I think, so I'm not saying this to be critical of anything that we're having today, but this panel is about looking forward. What must we do next?
I mean, here's the thing, like, you and I don't need to agree, first of all. A debate is fine and terrific. I actually think that we do agree on a bunch of stuff, though we're saying things in somewhat different ways. To me, a number of the things that you're underlining are at the heart of the issue I was raising, or in my mind, forgive me, they're at the heart of the issue I was raising about philanthropy's comfort zone, for that matter, the comfort zone of corporate decision makers, of local government, of others who influence resources in profound ways. One of the things we are looking at in our work, and this is not an advertisement for it, I'm just sharing something that we are, how do you help social movement organizations of today, including many led by young people, and many of them led by people of color, how do you help make them more sustainable, collaborative with each other, so that they can team up in really effective, high-impact ways? And, to your earlier point, forward-looking, not always having to play defense, but also being able to forecast, to look ahead 5 years, 10 years, in politics, in the economy, in technology, and a host of other things. We all know why it's been hard for social movement organizations in this country to do any of those things. And I'm not saying we have landed on some secret sauce or something. I'm sharing and trying to state it with all humility. We believe that asking those questions is a part of what you're talking about. And I wish more philanthropies, just to stick on philanthropy for a moment, that more donors wanted to be a part of that and saw that as a part of creating an inclusive and a just society, and didn't reduce everything to a demonstration theory of social change, or a technical problem, or something that could be fixed by a new mobile app, let's say. So I say this to say, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I'm maybe saying it in somewhat different ways, but if you feel like this is not what you're trying to get across, let's have at it too.
Let's let Michael get in the middle of this.
Well, I don't know if this is in the middle of this. I'll tell you what worries me the most these days, and I'll get to that in a second. First, I want to say no one has really said this, but I just want to be clear. I don't think that what we're doing is necessarily applicable everywhere all the time. I mean, God knows we've had failures. We've had failures in neighborhoods. We've had failures in entire cities where we have given up and gone away. So what we're doing is not necessarily, the reason I think what we're doing is important is, and this gets to what I worry about, I hear the conversations about skills training, about living wage jobs and getting people into living wage jobs. I hear the conversations about impact investing, this notion that you can take your assets and get a reasonable return and solve all of the social problems of the world at the same time. And it scares the hell out of me, because I don't think that a lot of this stuff applies to a lot of the communities where we work. We have an instrument called financial opportunity centers, where people come to get placed in jobs and job training and whatnot. Most of the people coming into those centers have educational levels at the 3rd or 4th grade level. Now they may have a high school diploma, but they're functioning at the 3rd or 4th grade level. Those people are not ready. They can't get into those training programs. So, I hear all of these, and some of it is public policy. I hear some of it out of Washington. But frankly, I hear some of it out of philanthropy as well. And I think that we are at risk at the moment of ignoring, forgetting about, moving away from the kinds of communities that all of our foundations have worked in for years. I mean, I'm not pointing the finger here, because you guys are doing it. But I think a lot of the public discourse is intentionally or unintentionally, just writing off a whole layer of the population. And that's who we think that we're trying to deal with, that we're trying to benefit with our neighborhood programs. And they're not necessarily applicable everywhere. And I also don't necessarily believe that they're somehow going to miraculously aggregate up into some kind of solution for, inequality of income in America. I really don't believe that. I think we're making incremental steps, and that's what we do. But it's at a level, and it's with a population, and it's in places that I think today run the risk of being, for all intents and purposes, written off.
But so if Zav came to you and said, given that predisposition, and given our predisposition to want to build next generation leadership and next generation inclusive community work, what would you say to him?
I think we're having that meeting in a couple of weeks, aren't we?
This is a preview, Michael.
I would say, I guess I would say, in general, I don't think that everything has to be susceptible to a new solution or a new treatment. I think there's an awful lot that's out there already that should be built on. The trick is finding it and figuring out where it is and how it's going to work. I think a second thing is to be brave, to be courageous about policies and programs that are not popular. For example, I happen to believe that this country needs some kind of public employment program for the kinds of communities that I'm talking about. And I'm not sure that anything else is going to work, frankly. Now, that's just for certain people in those communities. For the kids, education is a whole different thing. But, you can't even talk about that here. And, when the Obama administration did the stimulus program back in whenever the hell that was, 2008 or 9 or 10 or whatever, that's what I was praying that that's what they would do. Or, and this is applicable to Detroit, I thought it would be great if they took one subject, and in my head the subject was light rail. Light rail transportation. Every city in America is talking about that, wants to do it, is trying to do it. And what if we said, okay, we're going to change the way America travels. We're going to have a light rail, rapid transit program for the entire country. It's going to create jobs. People can work. It's going to do for mass transit what Eisenhower did for highways in the 50s. It could change so many things. And instead, I know why. I mean, it's too hard to do that. And so what we did in the stimulus was to just give everybody a little bit more money and hope that things. But I thought there was an opportunity lost there. But something like that, some massive public employment program to take people who, frankly, are not going to be able to do anything else and give them that opportunity. So now the Ford Foundation can't do that, I understand that, but the Ford Foundation can advocate for things that can accomplish that. And I think the Ford Foundation also is in a unique position to do what I said earlier, to find the things out there that are working and build on them rather. There's so much, God, this is going to get me in so much trouble. There's so much, and I come from the Pew Charitable Trust, and the Pew Charitable Trust is probably the single worst example of what I'm about to talk about, which is that they have gone completely inside. They have all of the answers. They know what they want to do. They're not going to be troubled by all these pesky grantees coming at them. They don't need to be bothered with that. They know, and they've got the solutions, and they've got the initiatives. And some of that, frankly, is being spread around the rest of philanthropy as well. I think that's really troubling, really troubling. There's so much, just the people in this room or you go out, there's so much out there that's going on and good people. And I don't think we necessarily lack leaders. I think we're not finding them. I think they're there. We don't have the mechanisms to go out and find them. So I don't know. I've said enough. That's.
Deb, you wanted to get in.
And I might as well. I'm announcing my retirement, by the way. I've just alienated the entire American philanthropic community.
Michael has made really, really important points, and I want to respond. Did you want to? I don't want to jump in.
Go ahead.
First of all, I completely agree with you. There's a romanticizing of the new. There's a hubris in philanthropy and other places about where the answers lie, and so on. I want to go back to the Recovery Act for just a moment, or the stimulus, because I lost a lot of sleep helping to put it together 5 years ago, 6 years ago. All those conversations were had. We know, present tense, we could create 2 to 3 million good jobs in this country through infrastructure alone. Labor markets were slack. The infrastructure need is clearly there. We have a whole new generation of needs because of the climate crisis, the need for resilient infrastructure. There is a marvelous apprenticeship infrastructure, institutional infrastructure built up in the building trades. There are serious questions of racial inclusion that need to be addressed there. But there's one really, really promising high-impact sector. Why did we not have it? Politics. Let's be honest.
No, I know.
It's not, and I'm not revealing anything here, but I'm just saying this is precisely why I'm saying you have to be interested in supporting creative politics, movement building, developing public will where we have answers. Where we know what would generate a tremendous virtuous cycle of employment, of investment, of skill building, and also lay a platform for economic growth in the way that infrastructure can. And that's just to name that one thing. You and I could agree on affordable housing and a bunch of other things that we know a lot about. But some of the serious barriers are still political. And I'm not seeking to turn this into a conversation just about, partisan politics and polarization in this country, though that's certainly a piece of the picture. But I do think that we have to call philanthropy, amongst other actors, to account to be a part of rebuilding the case for investing in public goods, whether it be physical infrastructure or education, in a way that really creates opportunity for all. At the same time, there are things you can seize on. There are active conversations, as you know, in the workforce field about alternative credentialing, about what do you do about someone who's functioning at a 3rd or 4th grade level? How do you, ban the box movements that are about ex-offenders and removing criminal records as a barrier to employment, to hiring, and so on. And a whole series of other things that we have terrific answers about. We have to build the will. We have to change how state legislatures are thinking about these things. Not just get one more set of cities to pass, living wage ordinances or whatnot. So I agree with you, and I think that there are a bunch of habits of philanthropy that need to be called out here.
Tonya.
I would say, Michael, I heard a person when they were retiring, the best strategy that they did, was they announced their retirement off 10 years, so you get this grace to do whatever you want to do. So I just think you should declare it, because I think if that's what it takes to get you to say more things like that, then we need to have everybody state their...
I just didn't mean it to be 10 minutes instead of 10 years.
But my point around it is that I do, absolutely. I think that we all would harmonize around most of these ideas. There's not a tension about the general ideas that we're talking about. I think where I'm trying to push us is how are we creating the tension and the debate in what we know, what we're learning, what we're projecting, in a way that it actually catapults the work. So if we don't have that, if we don't really have a pivot, if we're only making incremental changes in the field, then I think we're doing a disservice to the folks that we're trying to help in these neighborhoods and places. And I also think that we're doing a disservice to the field. So when I think about what's happening in the field, and I think about as the Obama administration sunsets, we have hundreds of place-based initiatives. Some of them will have some results, some of them won't. There are going to be some wins, and there are going to be some losses. And it's going to create a very interesting cliff in which a new administration comes in, if it supports it or not, where we are going to have, as a field, have to defend what we have done in order to make it sustainable, right? Or to get others to invest in it. And I guess I would suggest that if we know that that is our political environment that we're going to walk in, what's our proactive and offensive move on that? I guess I am trying to say we need to move the conversation beyond distilling what has happened in the past to think about where we need to go in the future. So it's not a question about whether I disagree with, who would disagree? I actually asked to go before him because I was like, after I heard him talk at breakfast this morning, I was like, I am not going after him. But my point is,
Thanks a lot, Tonya.
right, I was like, let Michael do that. But my point around it is that at some point we have to provoke each other into the kinds of conversations we need to have. Otherwise, if we're not provoking ourselves into it, somebody else will, and we will be unprepared.
So let's take that further,
Yeah,
if that's okay, Reb.
it is.
I don't know when you want to engage with. Let's talk about Barack Obama for a second and George W. Bush, okay? I think Tanya's absolutely right. With the Neighborhood Revitalization Initiative, Promise, Choice, Sustainable Communities, Burn, all of it, and more, others that aren't on that short list. There is always a vulnerability. So you're absolutely right to call this out as a question that commands all of our energies and imagination. I don't propose to have the answers. I have a couple of observations, though, in part from having worked in government and also worked, like folks here, with movement builders, and others who care a lot about what government does. How do these things get institutionalized? How does it become impossible for a subsequent administration, for the majority leader of the Senate, for committee chairs in Congress and in either house? How does it become really hard for them to oppose something or to undo it, as opposed to saying, this is interesting, but I want to take it in a new direction, or I want to take it to the next level? I think there's a series of answers to that, and nobody has all of them, but let me make a quick observation relating George W. Bush to Barack Obama, because that isn't done a lot these days. When President Obama took office, one of the things we noted was that his administration had made a particular commitment to the problem of chronic homelessness. And without exaggerating the nature of that commitment or the nature of the extent of progress made, there were some things that were very clear about why the commitment was there in place and what changes had happened, and also how we, in the Obama administration, working with a new Congress, could build on them. And if I had to boil it all down, it turned out to be the case that the Bush administration, working with others, including local leaders, identified ways, agreed that the evidence was clear, that it made sense to grow solutions like supportive housing, to spend on the front end, and not to recognize those costs, not to deal with these problems through emergency room visits and county jails and all the back-end destructive, inhumane sorts of ways that we still do. And that was something, sure, it happens that George W. Bush was succeeded by a president who was friendly to that agenda, to expanding on a solution like that. You don't always have that transition. But the point is, it was nearly impossible to argue with that fundamental case that you're going to spend anyway. The costs are there. There is a demonstrated solution. It's not cheap, by the way. It takes real money to do this, and it takes will to make those resources available. But it is an area in which, over a relatively short span of time, the research, the local innovation, the experimentation, and the running of the case from local communities all the way to Washington, to appropriators, to the president in charge, actually made a difference and laid a foundation that in the Obama years we tried to build on. I think there are ways in which you can think about progress that the Obama administration has made, some of the signature initiatives and whatnot, and likewise strengthen them, make the case to new constituencies, and broaden, frankly, the support, and that's going to be critical. And some of what we're talking about earlier, young leadership, business leadership, and some unusual suspects are going to be important to doing those things. No one administration can sort of create things that have a permanence without that kind of outside activism calling for it and demanding it. Yep.
I'm Jennifer Vanica with Vanica Cummings Community Change Consulting, and Tonya, my hat's, if I had a hat on, I'd take it off to you. I really appreciate where you've kind of been taking this conversation, and Michael, I'm glad to see you're going to take one for the team. And I agree with you, Tonya, that we have as a field been very good at collecting lessons and distilling lessons, and maybe not so good at actually applying them in the field. And that when you ask the question about where is the provoking conversation going to happen, one of the questions I kind of wanted to pose, Peter, you reminded me of this Peter Block line where he says, if you want a future that's distinct from the past, you have to be with people who you're not used to being with and have conversations that you're not used to having. And somebody was asking me who seems to be missing from this room, and obviously we don't have people heavily representing the actual communities that we're trying to serve. And it's very often in that dynamic that catalytic conversation that make you rethink the world happens. So in thinking, there is we kind of like to see change, talk about change like it's out there rather than in here. As you look at the field of philanthropy, we're still largely using the same two tools we've used for 100 years. Do you see that there is an appetite, I think, to use Zab's phrase, is there an appetite for catalytic changes in the whole structure as well as the strategy of foundations to actually help them be greater risk takers?
I often talk about this with our team at the foundation. Two things. One is you cannot be for change and not be willing to change yourself, and understanding that there is loss in change. That we often ask people, and we're asking systems, we're asking everybody to change because it's for the greater good. And even the people we want to benefit from that there is loss in that. So if you're a parent, in our instance, as a foundation, we work on children's issue. If you're a parent and somebody is saying, I'm going to send your kid to college, and that kid goes to college, there is loss for that parent. And you probably are thinking, how is that loss? Well, you have to give up a lot of different things. You have to give up, that you may not have been successful at this, that your child is going to be more successful than you, that your child will begin to view you in a different way than you've ever been viewed before. You have to actually send your child to a place that you don't trust. There's a ton of loss that people have, and I just think that we have to wrap our heads around change, and I think that has to be driven with inside of institutions. I think that it's this kind of, I feel like it's a challenging position for philanthropy. We need a change, we need to be nimble, but at the same time, I also know what that does to the sector, right? So as soon as a foundation learns, so if you're gonna learn and you're gonna be nimble, it's like whiplash to the sector, right? So we have to learn and change and be nimble and figure out how we communicate and bring people along fast enough, or making sure that they're bringing us along fast enough so that it actually is a conversation that moves the needle and I think moves philanthropy. So I think that that's one of the big challenges around philanthropy is how do you do that? So I guess the timing is coming up. And then the second thought that I had about this is that it's just a reiteration of what we've already said, is that as we're moving towards being results-driven, and I'm one of the main people who talks about how we have to be results-driven. We can't just be satisfied with doing good. We actually have to be satisfied with having results that show good that has been done. That we are losing, I think, this point that Michael is making about that none of us is smart as all of us, that we're not creating the space in philanthropy to really have an inclusive conversation, and that if we're only bringing the knowledge into the field, and then we actually expect that our teams are going to be the people who curate that knowledge and distribute it and distribute strategies around that, I think that the field is in a lot of ways going backwards.
We are out of time. Anything you want to throw on the table, either Zav or Michael?
30 seconds on Jennifer's really important question. On appetite for risk, I hope so. Point number one. Point number two, the jury's still out, I think, on whether it will expand, on whether it will grow. And that's true, I think, for a bunch of reasons. This is something we have to create. We've got to push on this. And point number three, I think it's risk of various kinds. Yeah. It's political risk some days of the week and reputational risk that can be most salient. In other instances, it's financial risk and deploying capital in truly bold ways. And exploring that is a longer conversation and maybe a way that we can build on the last day and a half. But I think it's risk of various kinds. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I just want to go on the record saying that. Thanks for your question.
Michael, last word, anything?
No, I don't think so.
Unfortunately, we don't have time. I've gotten, the first signal was, please wrap up, and the second was, enough already. So we, unfortunately, we need to conclude, but thank you to an extraordinary panel.